I have a friend who left the Navajo Reservation a few years ago. This is what he learned while living there. I'm going to preface this by explaining that this story is not mine, I'm just the one who wrote it all down. I'm not Dene, the actual name of the Navajo, and this is how I will refer to them from here on out. Never lived on a reservation, and know very little about their folklore. I actually was a skeptic in all things paranormal for a really long time until something happened to me a few years ago, that made a believer out of me. Nothing to do with skinwalkers or things of that nature, but it definitely made me at least believe in ghosts. I will also be releasing this parts for easier reading, it's a long one. This story was told to me by my Dene friend, Sam, name changed for his privacy, and comes from his own experience. I met Sam on a photography gig a few years after graduating art school, and we connected through our shared interest in the paranormal. We would swap stories about our personal paranormal experiences. Well, I only have one experience, so it wasn't nearly as reciprocal, and what I'm about to tell you is probably the most memorable of his. All names have been changed at Sam's request for privacy, and I'm using an alt account. Sam also gave me permission to write this and fully cooperated with me as I put this together. According to him, he's too lazy and I have too much time on my hands, so he was cool with me putting this together. Sam is full-blooded Dene. His mother and father grew up in the nation near New Mexico. They had Sam out of wedlock, at a very young age, and broke up a few years after he was born. His mother moved to Illinois with his now stepfather, who is white and Catholic. Sam grew up in a Chicago suburb and lived there most of his childhood and teenage years. He would visit his dad for a couple weeks a few times a year, but never really spent a prolonged amount of time out on the reservation. It was at 20 that Sam moved in with his dad on the res to get a better understanding of my heritage, as he said it, and stayed there till he was about 24. He was very interested in his Dene heritage, especially when he started developing his art practice as a painter and photographer. As he spent more and more time on the res, he grew a deep interest in Dene superstition, I guess as a way to connect to his culture, that he felt he didn't do enough to be a part of in his childhood and teenage years, since he essentially assimilated into Midwestern, suburban, white culture due to his mother and stepdad. While on the res, he made friends with and eventually dated a girl, whom we'll call Jess, who had fully grown up on the res. She was a little older than Sam and got her teaching degree in another state before coming back to the res to teach high school. She was basically agnostic, more on that in a bit, but had a very superstitious family. In fact, her great-uncle, whom we'll call John, was a medicine man. I'm not super familiar with the details surrounding this practice, and Sam didn't go into a ton of detail in regards to this either. But basically, he was a very respected elder, and was extremely superstitious. He often spoke of Dene folklore, creatures, magic, etc., and took it all very seriously. John was pretty old and often needed help around his property, so Sam was often over there helping him out with odd jobs. Sam felt weird taking money from the old man, especially since Sam already had a part-time job as an art teacher and sold his paintings and photos in Santa Fe art markets for pretty good money. So as payment, Sam would ask John to share some of his knowledge with him. It was Sam's way of connecting to his heritage, he told me. They'd talk for an hour or two every night that Sam came over to help. Sam would basically grill him on every random, Dene-related thing under the sun and would, generally, get an earful about it. Except when it came to one specific topic. Lushi. Sam, having spent most of his childhood with his mom and stepdad off the res, didn't have the same outlook on skinwalkers that other Dene did. The whole don't speak of them thing wasn't something he subscribed to, mainly because A, Sam grew up in the Chicago area where no skinwalkers would be around anyway, and B, he was raised Catholic, and didn't believe in Dene superstitions. He was pretty interested in this part of Dene lore because of how common skinwalkers were in creepypasta, on boards like /x/and, of course, Reddit. So naturally, his interest in them disturbed John, and he generally shut down any discussion of them. When he brought this up to Jess, She got visibly upset and asked him to never speak of them to her or her great-uncle ever again. This was weird to Sam, since Jess wasn't superstitious, or even religious for that matter. He thought his agnostic girlfriend wouldn't be so weird about these things. She explained to Sam that, despite her general agnosticism, that was one thing she knew was real, because she and other members of her family had experiences. She told him a very similar story to the types you'll see posted online, late at night on the res, driving home, and seeing what you think is a coyote or a sheep following you at an alarming speed, only to, upon closer inspection, see what appears to be human underneath animal skin, or a half-man, half-coyote kind of creature. This happened to Jess when she was a little girl, while being driven home by her father. Great-Uncle John came and performed some sort of protection/cleansing ritual that they thought protected them, at least for a few years. It wasn't until Jess moved back after getting her degree did she encounter one again, this time running along the rooftops of some homes and buildings in town. She thought somehow someone's dog got up on their roof, but it would then get on two legs and jump to the next building. After landing, it would perch up there, sitting cross-legged, staring her down with yellow eyes. She sped home so fast she got pulled over by the tribal police. When she explained what she saw and why she was speeding, the officer shushed her, tore up the ticket he was writing, and told her to get her ass home. Uncle John came by again and performed a ritual. Jess said that according to John, though, the creature wasn't after her, and was caught in the act of stalking someone else. That made it set its eyes upon her, so she was to be extra cautious, and, her words, shut the hell up about them forever. She only told Sam all of this to keep the things off her and her family. But, wouldn't you know it, that just made him more interested. And who could blame him, really? It seems as though Sam kind of whittled down John's resolve on the issue, because eventually, the old man budged a little bit. He revealed to Sam a few bits and pieces of information over the years. I'm just going to copy and paste from some Instagram DMs he sent me while I put this whole story together. Note that the only changes I have made to his messages were the names of those involved. Also, in case it isn't obvious, Sam abbreviates Skinwalker to SW.
The first thing John told me about SW was that they can't actually read minds like they say in the stories and stuff. It was basically what you'd call an old wives' tale, because they didn't want their kids talking about that shit and spreading the idea that this was something people could do. I think they wanted the practice of being SW to die out completely, so they thought by forbidding people from talking about it nobody would be curious enough to try out black magic and shit. I think because Dene are so steeped in oral traditions that they basically believed, if enough people stop talking about a thing, it dies forever. But you know you can't tell people not to talk about something, lol. So they said that if you talk about SW it will make them interested in you and seek you out. It was just them trying to scare kids. The other thing is that they are just regular people, not monsters. They don't have any special powers. Just knew a lot about certain things that a lot of us don't. Like how there are things you know how to do, as a video guy, author's note, I'm a videographer by trade, that regular people who've never done it don't. Like when you show them a really cool edit you did or shots you pulled off in there, whoa, how did you do that? Same kind of stuff. They just spent a lot of time learning about stuff that makes them able to do what they do. They studied animals and how they move, making suits, studied poisons, hallucinogens, shit like that. They're medicine men just like John. In fact, a lot of them are openly good medicine men in the community, and nobody knows they practice this stuff. It's just another form of their medicine men stuff, but they use it for people who want to harm or scare others. Like, they get hired to mess with people. John told me this one story about a close friend, who was also a medicine man in the Tuba City area, that had an asshole in the neighborhood who kept bitching about his property lines or something like that. He was building a fence and there was a big fuss about it. The guy harassed the shit out of his next door neighbor because of it, but the neighbor knew where his land started and ended and so didn't budge. Eventually some weird shit started to go down. The asshole's neighbor was talking about how there was a gigantic coyote in his backyard that would look in the windows at night and scare the shit out of him and his GF. He would hang in his backyard with a shotgun around sundown, which of course weirded out everyone in the neighborhood, and a lot of folks were saying that he was mentally unstable. But then people in the neighborhood started hearing messed up noises, and someone saw the coyote stand on its hind legs and look in the windows. Then one day the guy's girlfriend drove him to the emergency room because he was having a really bad trip, apparently, like hallucinating and talking about this coyote man who was threatening to kill him. John doesn't know what he was on, if it was like peyote, or something. He came down a few hours later, and a lot of people in town laughed it off, but John's friend, and a few other people in the neighborhood, like I assume the ones who actually saw the coyote man, knew that it was probably a skinwalker messing with him. John said that SW know a lot about hallucinogens, how to get the results they want from them, and how to administer them to their victims without them knowing. Like they know so much about the compounds and shit that they know exactly how it will affect you and how to screw with you when you're on them. So John's friend came by to bless the place and perform a ritual, and the weird shit stopped. Because skinwalkers are medicine men themselves, they also believe in the power of the rituals that are used against them. That's how I would say these things work. Nothing super magical or paranormal about it, they just have strong beliefs and know not to screw with certain shit. Anywho, so he thinks that the asshole neighbor's sick to SW on him to get him to move out of town or something like that. The last thing John told me for a really long time was about how SW were actually good guys at one time. They created that whole practice to mess with the colonizers. They protected other Dene and scared away white people, trying to take land and assault people and stuff. But some started using the practice for their own gain, and once the treaties were signed and we got land back and all, that they just started exclusively using it to do bad stuff to other Dene.
After this, John basically put a kibosh on Skinwalker talk. Sam told me he thought it was weird that John didn't want to talk about them. After all, John said it himself that Skinwalkers can't read minds, and talking about them didn't draw their attention to you. As Sam said, it's an old wives' tale. He even told this to Jess, but she shot him down. She actually kind of insulted him apparently, telling Sam that he's not culturally a Dene so he wouldn't understand, and him trying to get this deep into Skinwalker stuff was offensive their heritage. Basically he was culturally a white boy, and should shut the hell up. Now, I know some reactionary types on the internet would probably take offense to this, but it's not unfounded. How would you like it if some cultural outsider came into your town and started grilling you about your long-held beliefs, while directly contradicting them? I realize that the last post presented a grounded, realistic idea of the Skinwalker, but this is where we start getting into some real supernatural shit. And because of that, I do want to preface everything I say here with the disclaimer that what I'm about to tell you I cannot verify. I am not Dene, and I know very few folks who are native, much less culturally native. I don't live anywhere near the Four Corners either. This is all from the recollection of one Dene friend of mine, who is retelling stories and information given to him by a much older man. Believe what you can, or take everything with a grain of salt. At any rate, I hope it's a fun read. It's much longer this time around, sorry in advance for the length. After learning the truth about Skinwalkers, and being scolded by his girlfriend, Sam took the hint and for a while focused his time spent with John on things the old man actually wanted to talk about. Sam learned a lot about his culture and the practice of medicine men, and worked on this gorgeous 4x5 portrait series of elderly folks on the res. Sam told me that it was around this time that he realized he was pretty callous in the way he approached the Skinwalker subject. He was just a dumb kid raised in white America who thought he was being curious about his native culture when really he was spending more time chasing spooky stories than actually learning about his people. By this point Sam had been living on the res for about 4 or so years. He even got a full-time teaching job at one of the reservation's schools. He moved out of his dad's place and got his own. Sam always had planned to move back to Illinois or to some bigger city with more of an art scene, but wanted to spend much more time on the res, at least another 5 years. Despite that desire to stay, and his new job, he and Jess ended up moving to my city only a few months into his full-time position, and that's around the time I met him. His usual response to why they both left was that he needed to be somewhere with a bigger art scene and community, and Jess wanted to go back to school to get an MSW. But it wasn't until I got to know him reasonably well, and we started bonding over our shared interest in the paranormal, did he actually tell me why they left. From our DMs.
John was getting up there in age. Late 80s. Dude lived a long life. Had some cancer in his 60s and beat it, but he would tell me that he always wondered when it would come back to take him. I think it was like in 2014 or something.
Author's note, Sam moved to the res in 2010, met John a few months after that.
He was diagnosed with lung cancer that metastasized to his liver, pancreas, colon. He was given only a few months to a year to live. Friggin' sucked to hear because we were basically brothers by this point. For being as old as he was really sharp. Must have been the medicine man shit that staved off senility, lol.
After the diagnosis, Jess, her father, and Sam spent a lot more time with the old man helping him out around the house. He was by this point bedridden, and had refused to be put in hospice care as he thought it was a waste of the family's money for, as Sam put it, a mildly more comfortable death. A few months in, Sam received a call from John asking him to come over that evening.
He told me that he had some stuff he wanted to tell me that he didn't want to die with him. I assumed he felt like he was on his way out based on that. I packed my T2i in case he was cool with me recording him.
When Sam arrived, John was just sitting on his porch, watching the sunset. He beckoned Sam to sit next to him and told him he had some last bits of knowledge to share. When Sam mentioned that he brought his camera with him, John allowed him to film, with his only request being that he wouldn't show it to anyone and that he would stop recording when asked.
We spent like an hour or so just talking about whatever came to his mind. It was a lot of stuff I've told you before, stuff like parts of the res that are cursed, portals to other dimensions, and then stuff like how to bless your home, what plants do what, how to find your way home if you're lost in the desert. Also some songs and prayers that I had to have on tape because it was in the language and I am trash at it. It was like he was trying to cover everything he felt like he hadn't told me before. He basically said I would be his closest thing to an informal apprentice, as he never actually passed on his knowledge to one before. He said was keeping some knowledge for himself, still, but wanted to share what he felt comfy with.
It was here that I asked Sam why John would tell his great-niece's boyfriend from Chicago all of this, if it's supposedly Danae secrets and stuff.
I don't know, man, it's a little different than that. Like I did a lot for him, renovated his home, built him a porch, even helped him get internet and gave him my old MacBook and showed him how to use it. I gave him my old Wii and he became friggin' obsessed with Wii Sports. Pretty sure he felt like he owed me because of everything I helped him with and refused to take a cent. I get why it seems weird, but also I feel like he didn't have anyone interested enough to just sit down and hear him talk for hours on end, so appreciated me for that or something. Or maybe he was actually senile or just messing with me, lol. But I doubt it. He was pretty sharp in his old age and also was a genuine guy.
After the sun went down, John requested that they turn off the camera and go inside. Once inside, he asked Sam to turn on the TV and raise the volume. He explained that it was important that no one hear their conversation. According to Sam, the old man didn't have any neighbors for miles, so he found that a little odd, at least, until he learned what their conversation was about. "I haven't been honest with you about Yinaldlushi," he said. He then requested that Sam burn some plants/herbs/mixture of some sort that he had put on top of the logs in his fireplace. This was so, according to John, no one in this world or the other could hear them. It seems, and this is just Sam's read of the situation, that John thought by writing skinwalkers off as just assholes who dress in animal skins and drug people with peyote or shrooms to mess with them, Sam's words, he would discourage the young man from ever looking any further into the legends. And while that was definitely true, there were skinwalkers who had no powers, no connection with the supernatural, and were just Danae occult fanatics who played dress-up. That was only part of the story. Yinaldlushi exist in two varieties. The first, John had already explained to Sam. Medicine men with no actual supernatural powers, just a very extensive knowledge of various hallucinogenic compounds, able to craft very convincing outfits of animal pelts, and can move and behave very similarly to whatever animal they wish to mimic. These folks were accessible to the general population on the res. When I say accessible, of course, I don't mean just anyone can seek them out. It takes someone well connected, as well as depraved enough, to want to seek them out to bother or even harm others. These skinwalkers would often receive monetary compensation for their deeds. Like the hypothesis in John's Tuba City story. They based this entire practice on the legends of shapeshifters and dark witches in Dene folklore. This explains a good portion of skinwalker stories and lore you see posted online. Large coyotes or sheep behaving oddly, only to, upon closer inspection, reveal that they are a person wearing animal skins. But what about the other stories? The stories of these beings, half man, half beast, pulling off unnatural feats around the res. Running alongside cars at top speed, mimicking voices, reading and even controlling minds, immune to firearms, shapeshifting into incredibly convincing, terrifying, gigantic wolf-like creatures, glowing red or yellow eyes, and faces that are neither human nor animal? Well, you guessed it, those are the real Yinaldlushi. Powerful, dark witches who have terrorized the Dene, and sometimes others, for centuries. John theorized that skinwalkers developed sometime around the time when the first settlers arrived. Medicine men in the tribes were incredibly wary of these visitors, and as time went on they revealed themselves to be conquerors. The medicine men, as Sam put it, turned to the dark side in order to scare them off and terrorize them. Medicine men back then knew that by turning to the practice of black magic, there wasn't really any turning back. Black magic robs them of humanity and corrupts their souls, but they believed that they could do this for the good of their people, and then, once the colonizers were driven out, be dealt with by their own people. In fact, some medicine men revealed their plans for this to other members of their practice who opted not to participate in the rituals. They gave them detailed instructions on how to protect themselves and even kill them when necessary. Unfortunately, we know how this turned out. And now, we have the uniquely Dene problem of the skinwalkers. And unlike the other skinwalkers, the pretenders in animal fur, these Yinaldlushi are not human, or at least, not in a sense that is recognized by the Dene. In order to become one of these things, they must participate in a ceremony that essentially robs them of their humanity. And, after a long enough time living as one of them, they barely even resemble a human in appearance. Think of the Wendigo of Algonquin origin, a creature that was once human, but through some horrific, twisted process or ritual became something else entirely. The practice of being a skinwalker is jealously guarded, even more so than that of the pretenders. It requires committing heinous acts, murder and or torture of a family member or friend, ingesting poisons and human flesh, and communicating with entities from other dimensions. Skinwalkers are also a people unto themselves, an isolated subculture of the Dene that branched off a long time ago. Although they make their home in the same region as the Dene, they generally do not live among them, fraternize with them, or trade with them. They are a completely separate community. And some would say, completely separate species as well. John did not go into great detail on the process of becoming a skinwalker. He said no man who calls himself Dene would ever know such things. That might have been true a century ago, when skinwalkers still lived amongst the people, but in this day and age the skinwalker is much too concerned with being found out, and so they isolated themselves, and brought all knowledge with them. Think of those tribes that are still being discovered in the jungles of Africa and South America, completely cut off from the rest of the world. Only this tribe is well aware of the rest of society, and chooses to isolate. That all being said, of course, they still do go out amongst the people. It's just usually at night, amongst only a small group of folks, and only for their own dark purposes. Exactly what skinwalkers gain from their behavior towards the Dene, and occasional tourists, is disputed amongst medicine men, John says. John's understanding was that, aside from stealing livestock, their abilities feed off of the fear they instill in others. Murder also strengthens their connection to whatever dark entities they commune with. But a death directly at the hands of a skinwalker is exceedingly rare. John then went to say how a lot of things that are sometimes attributed to deaths of despair, such as suicide, overdose, alcohol poisoning, etc., could be traced to very powerful skinwalkers. It's said that a basic trait of the skinwalker is being able to instill fear in their victims, like a weak form of mind control. More powerful skinwalkers can actually cause folks to harm themselves. John wasn't sure, however, if the mind control rumors were true. Corpse powder, the fabled favorite weapon of the skinwalker, blown on their victims' faces, could actually be how they make these things happen. While some say corpse powder is a powerful poison that slowly kills over the course of a few days, leaving no trace of itself in one's system, others insist it's a drug that makes the victim highly suggestible. I've heard of things like this before. Criminals in some parts of South America use something similar to make their marks essentially empty their bank accounts for them. John believes in both explanations. It is sometimes a cocktail of poison and human bone, and sometimes it's a drug that makes one highly suggestible, and the skinwalker uses this to instruct the victim to harm or kill themselves somehow. Direct contact with their victims is too risky, both for the individual skinwalker as well as their clan, and is likely frowned upon. When a skinwalker does physically kill someone, the person either disappears or has their corpse found much later, with their death ruled as an animal attack. John says that this is more common amongst weaker skinwalkers. One detail that stood out to Sam was the idea that skinwalkers communicate with entities from other dimensions, and he pressed John on this a bit more. In Sam's words,
"He knew I was raised Catholic, so he explained them to me as basically being demons, although the Dene have their own name for them. Don't remember what it was, but even if I did, I prob couldn't spell it lol. They are evil inhuman spirits that try and come into our realm, or dimension or plane, or whatever, but don't exactly have a physical presence. So they possess people, or in the case of SW, they use them as their connection to this world. So some SW do the bidding of demons, and in return the demons give them powers." But John also said that some really old SW aren't even people anymore. They're living corpses, but demons live inside them. Guess the idea is that demons give them powers in exchange for letting the demon desecrate their corpse by using it as their flesh puppet after they die.
According to John, they communicated with these beings through their knowledge of the portal system in the American Southwest. This included places that are off the reservation, although skinwalkers were wary about going off the res as it can be more densely populated, and carries with it a risk of being discovered. The few times they do, they are good at keeping a low profile, being actual shapeshifters and all. But due to their nature they can't resist feeding off of the fear of others, so small groups of campers and people driving alone at night off the res have stories as well. Sometimes lone visitors outside the reservation, but near a portal, who are off camping, hiking, what have you, will straight up disappear under weird circumstances. This may be a stretch, but this instantly reminded me of David Paulides, Missing 411 research. I highly doubt skinwalkers are to blame for the majority of these mysterious disappearances. They're spread out all around the US, and skinwalkers do not venture very far outside Dene land, but if what John is saying is true, a few of them could have possibly fallen prey to one. These portals often exist in caves and small canyons, and require a lengthy ritual full of incantations, offerings, dances, and a sacrifice to open. What the sacrifice is, John isn't sure, but hypothesizes that some of the disappearing hikers may have something to do with it. When the portals open, they are used for a variety of things: communication with spirits and demons, gaining more power, summoning entities into our world, or even throwing themselves, or others, into the portals and leaving our world. Sam asked why they would go into the portals, and what existed beyond them. It was another dimension that allowed them to observe our world but not interact with it, as well as see things and beings that we couldn't in our plane. He said that they would interact in that dimension with beings called Chindis, which are the evil spirits of the deceased, said to be a manifestation of everything that was bad about a person. They would send Chindis out to not only harm others and spread illness, but also report on which people were growing wise to the skinwalkers. This was where the belief that skinwalkers are not to be discussed comes from. Chindis could listen in on your conversations, and report back to the skinwalkers who commune with them, and then, using portals, show them where the offending individual lived. It was very important to the skinwalkers that much of the general populace knew precious little about them, their culture, their practices, and most importantly, their identities. Nowadays, of course, because skinwalkers isolate, protecting their identities was not as crucial, as anyone who saw their original forms would never be able to recognize them, as they were not members of the community. But John noted that there were select skinwalkers who would live alongside the communities, and sometimes in them, as a way of feeding off others' energies without directly frightening or stalking them.
He told me a little story about this group of folks who lived near a weird old witch. This was back in the 1980s, I think. She would come into town but never buy anything from the stores or the markets or anything like that. Just walk around. Stare at people. One day a guy and his wife went into one of the cities off the res for the weekend, and while at a restaurant, saw her looking through the window at them. I actually painted my interpretation of this a while back. It's the one I showed at, gallery name redacted, when they first opened. So they were wondering how TF she got out there, and it scared the shit out of them. Like she just lived in a Hogan and didn't even have a car. She ended up disappearing, and that night the wife had a dream that the old lady had gotten down on all fours and turned into a screwed up looking coyote. On their way back to the res the next evening, they saw what they thought was a wounded coyote on the side of the road. The husband was going to get out to see what was up, but the wife made him stop. The coyote was looking straight at her, with the same stare that she saw in the old woman's eyes. It leapt up on its hind legs and ran off. The next day, the wife told everyone she could that the old lady was a SW. Rumor has it that the old witch got sick and died the next day.
Note the rumor has it. Many people believe that learning, and telling others of, a skinwalker's identity can spell disaster for them, and is one of the few ways an average person can kill them. However, this is only partially true. It weakens the skinwalker by not only robbing them of their prey, they can't feed off the fear of people who know them as just a frail, old lady, but doesn't kill them. What does kill them, however? Other skinwalkers. According to John, the woman did not die of a random, sudden illness. She simply left town, he believes, to go back to her local skinwalker community. However, the next day she was found, not far from her Hogan, mauled by a pack of animals. Wolf bites, bear claw marks, and even evidence of being trampled by a horse were found on her corpse. When the authorities found the body, a local medicine man, whom John knew, instructed the police to say that she died of an illness. He wanted people to remain unaware that a community of skinwalkers was in their midst, so no curious, stupid folks would go looking for them. So, if skinwalkers are, save for a select few, an isolated group, how do they add more to their ranks?
They used to be easier to join. Like if you were a medicine man and knew how to find them, and had completed the first ritual on your own, they'd let you go through the rituals and train you. You have to complete the first ritual before even looking for the SWS, so they know you've reached a point of no return. John said he didn't actually know the order of the rituals, but he assumed it was the part where you kill a close friend or family member. So you couldn't really go back to regular society and you robbed yourself of your humanity too. It's how they know you're for real. Otherwise they just kill you on the spot, lol.
John told Sam he had no idea how modern skinwalkers recruited. The most likely scenario would probably be kidnapping someone very young and grooming them to murder the family they were taken from, or choosing to share their knowledge with people that the Chindi scouted out as a kindred spirit and potential addition to their ranks. It should be noted that according to John, pretenders almost never became real skinwalkers. No info on why. Sam and I guessed that they probably want pretenders to do their thing and continue to exist, to throw folks off of their trail. Finally, John had one last piece of information to share. Yes, these skinwalkers actually did transform into animals, and it was often to varying degrees of success. The more skilled skinwalkers could mimic an animal perfectly, to the point where you wouldn't be able to pick them out amongst a pack or a herd. But the problem is, A regular old coyote or sheep isn't scary if it looks and behaves exactly as it should. So skinwalkers purposefully transform into imperfect or unnatural creatures. Things such as larger size, weird proportions, even human features mixed in. One story that stood out to me in regards to the way skinwalkers present, mainly because it had to do with the infamous Skinwalker Ranch, my personal least favorite skinwalker story because it sounds so ridiculous and is barely even about actual skinwalkers, is as follows.
Okay, so first off let me say I think Skinwalker Ranch is mostly bullshit. John's heard the stories and says it's white people crap lol. People say it's land cursed by Dene because the Utes stole it from Usum and they think we sick to SW on it. But we know that's not possible because they exist separate to the Dynam and we can't summon them. But there was a SW on that property. Several probably, a tribe of SWS that just refused to leave, so the Utes said it was a Dene curse. But most of the crazy UFO shit just doesn't track with me or John. Maybe some of it because Dene have seen shit, but I don't know. Loda, it sounds bunk. But anyway, the reason I bring up SW Ranch is because one of the stories from the white people who lived there was that they saw this big ass wolf, like bigger than any wolf in existence, size of a horse maybe. This was actually true, I'm sure of it at least. They prob added the UFO stuff for fun, cause just saying you saw a big wolf isn't a crazy enough story. But yay, this wolf is example of how they'll become a real animal, but they'll add some detail that doesn't add up or doesn't look right, and makes it 10 times scarier. And sometimes the transformations aren't perfect anyway and they keep it that way instead of trying to perfect it. There was this other story I heard, on /x/most likely, lol, about a guy who saw a giant Doberman looking thing with yellow eyes, but looked like it had bits of flesh hanging off, like a zombie dog. I don't know how true the story is, but it does point out this trait. What happens when a SW absorbs the skin of the animal they kill, but it's not a perfect specimen, or the skin has started to decompose before they absorb it, but it looks scary AF, so they don't mind. I'll bet some of them even wait for the flesh to rot before it's absorbed.
What Sam is talking about here is how they transform. Basically, they can only transform into animals they kill themselves. They must skin the animal and cover themselves in the pelt, often while it is still warm and bloody. After a certain period of time, the animal skin will be absorbed by the skinwalker, and not only will they gain the ability to transform into the animal at will, but some of the beast's features will begin to show in the skinwalker's human form. This is how many older skinwalkers, as they age, begin to gradually lose certain human features, only to be replaced with more animalistic ones. Their human skin ages, even decays, while their animal skin does not, remaining in the same state it was upon absorption. This is where the stench of decay that many associate with skinwalkers comes from. It's the human being rotting. John began noticing that the fire was dying down, and it was getting late. He told Sam that he is not to speak a word of what he was told while on the reservation. The only way in which their speech was protected from the prying Chindis was the mixture in the fireplace, and the myriad of blessings John had performed earlier in the day. The loud television was there just in case anyone, human or skinwalker, was in the area and felt a desire to eavesdrop. He gave Sam a small wooden box filled with the same mixture he threw on the fire, as well as a few other various things that John said would offer protection. He told Sam not to take his possession of these things as some sort of free ticket to talk freely about skinwalkers, however. He said something about how he had many decades of experience in these matters, and felt safe. Plus, he was going to die soon, so if a skinwalker took him out of his misery, so be it. Sam didn't have that luck, so he needed to be on the side of caution. Off the res, he was free to blab all he wanted about the shapeshifters, because, as Sam said, who the hell would believe me anyways? The next day, as Sam was getting ready to pack up and leave school, he received a call from John. "Shouldn't have told you that stuff," he said, and then told him not to come by the property for a few days. He assured Sam that he had everything taken care of and was safe, but wanted to be sure. He hung up before Sam could even get a word in. He let Jess know her great-uncle had said over the phone, and, naturally, Jess had to know what it was John told him about. Sam, reluctantly, told her point blank that John had voluntarily given him more info on the Skinwalkers. He did not go into any level of detail on what it was John said, out of respect for the old man's wishes. Jess, according to Sam, went pale.
It's so weird seeing your partner, who you know is a big skeptic, get spooked by something like this, but I guess it all tracks. Raised Danae, hearing these stories and stuff. Also, just because you're agnostic, doesn't mean you don't have some belief in the paranormal. She told me that John probably attracted someone's attention by talking about that shit, but that we have to trust that he knows what he is doing. Then she told me I can't speak a word of what I heard and I am never to ask, or even allow John to tell me anything anymore. She said something like words have power. You're not culturally Danae, so you wouldn't get it. She laid into me a bit after that. I was kinda insulted, but in retrospect she was totally right. Hurts to hear, but I think we all gotta take a step back.
But Jess, alarmed as she was, put her trust in John and told Sam that they weren't to contact or visit his property until he said everything was okay. But that day never came. 2 nights later, Sam and Jess were awoken by a phone call from Jess's father. John was in the hospital, his health rapidly taking a turn for the worst. The two rushed to the hospital, but John had passed away of a heart attack before they got there. For a while after John's passing, Sam, Jess, and their families lived a pretty uneventful life. Sam thinks it was a period of about 3 or 4 months of relative calm. Jess had started looking into getting an MSW out of state, and Sam was struggling with the decision of whether or not he wanted to stay on the res or follow Jess wherever she would go. I asked Sam if there was any tension between him and Jess due to everything that happened, but he said they both sort of dropped the entire argument about Sam messing with Skinwalker knowledge. He does not think that Jess attributes what happened to John as a result of bringing Skinwalker attention onto him. After these 3 to 4 months of calm were up, strange things began occurring to Jess's family members. Her father, mother, and younger brother all complained of a group of coyotes that ran around their property, keeping them up several nights a week with their noises and scratching on the side of the house. Her father had taken to standing on the porch with a shotgun some nights, but never saw anything. Her cousin complained about missing livestock. They would completely disappear, but every once in a while a mutilated corpse of a cow would be found a few yards from the property. Sometimes it was a cow who had gone missing days earlier, and looked only freshly slaughtered. Then one night, Sam was staying over at Jess's house. While they were having dinner, Sam noticed that it had gotten oddly quiet outside. He told me that it was a particularly windy evening, but suddenly, no howling of the wind could be heard. That's when he heard something tapping on the window. Jess pointed at the window behind Sam. When he turned around to look, he caught a glimpse of a figure for only a split second before it vanished. But he could hear it walking away from the window, as the thing was very close to the house. The two were frozen in fear for a few seconds, before the howling of the wind returned. They drew the blinds. Sam said they barely slept that night. Jess told him that she saw a large wolf with glowing yellow eyes looking into their window. She says that it had a weird anthropomorphic vibe, and that it was smiling, like how a man smiles. There was a row of yellow teeth that looked oddly like human teeth. Jess found herself, in the coming days, triggered by this. She told Sam it reminded her all too well of the 2 beings she saw all those years ago. They had someone come by the property to bless it, and that was that for everything that transpired at Jess's home. A few weeks after the incident, Sam was awoken by a series of howls. The howls, he said, started far away, but were loud enough to jolt him awake. They grew in volume as they grew closer. Sam estimates they were about a minute or so in between, each howl getting closer. From far away, they sounded like your typical wolf or dog howl, but as they got closer, they sounded more bizarre, as he said it.
It's really hard to say exactly why these noises were so frightening, I don't know, bizarre. Like I was shivering in fear. I've never felt that way. Wave after wave after wave of chills, dude. My eyes were watering. I felt like I was having a panic episode. They didn't sound like any animals I knew. It started like a wolf howl, but then made weird gurgling noise that went on for a few more seconds after. The howls were really loud at the front end. Violent. Like they were a warning.
Suddenly, Sam heard a howl from inside his own home. He tells me he grabbed his pistol from his closet, nearly shot himself fumbling with it, and burst through his bedroom door, only to see an empty house, with the front and back doors wide open, swaying in the wind. Looking out the back door, he saw two wolves running away in the moonlight. But their gait was off, as though they had the wrong set of hind legs. The next day Sam dialed the medicine man who blessed Jess's place. He was an old friend of John's. When he came by, he first listened to Sam's story, and then inspected the home. The medicine man, in a sort of roundabout way, told him it was indeed a Yinal-Blushi, and that he had caught the attention of something very old, very powerful, and very evil. In fact, the medicine man had never heard of any being of the sort actually entering another person's dwelling. That fact alone terrified the man, enough to where he said,
He was just like, I don't know what my blessing will do. Best case scenario will keep it off your property. It won't keep it off you. Worst case scenario will make it mad.
Sam also showed the man the box of items that John had given him, to see if that held any significance. The man frowned, saying he didn't wish to speak ill of the dead, but John had made a small error in giving Sam what he thought were things that would protect him. The man went to his truck and came back with another item. I should note, Sam won't tell me what the items were. This is out of secrecy/respect for certain Dene traditions. He also says that he didn't even know what half of the stuff was. He told Sam to put that with the others, but that it was no guarantee. He said there was no one-size-fits-all solution to warding off dark witches. Witches, which by the way is how he refers to SW, are very superstitious, but some more than others. Some of them have learned that certain practices don't do anything, so they just laugh those off, while some others find that disrespectful. Finally, he performed the blessing. He told Sam that if things don't improve, he may need to seek help from someone else, or multiple others, and then gave him the info of some other medicine men whom he trusted. He closed out by saying that John was probably the best person he knew to deal with these things, in spite of the slip-up with the items he gave Sam, and lamented his passing. That night, Sam said he slept soundly, which continued for about a week. Then, one night, Sam woke up to use the bathroom. He didn't switch on any lights, but noticed two very disconcerting things.
For one, it was freezing. We live in the desert, but it's never been that cold at night that time of year, and I didn't have the AC on. Because I'm not a diva like you. And also it friggin' reeked.
His house smelled of rotting flesh. After relieving himself, he went back to bed. And then had an incredibly vivid dream. 6 tall, lanky, ashen-skinned men in animal pelts, wearing skulls with bits of flesh still clinging to them. He remembers them clear as day. 2 appeared to be dressed as wolves, one as a sheep, one as a coyote, and another as a deer, with broken antlers. They were standing around, all glaring at him with striking yellow eyes. They barely moved, like living statues.
They looked like people who hadn't eaten in weeks. Almost zero body fat or muscle. And one of them did not look well. The deer man. I'm talking about gray skin, infections, oozing, almost like a zombie. It was disgusting.
Sam woke up in a cold sweat. He told me that in the dream, he was just standing there as their eyes bore into him. He actually knew he was dreaming while it was happening, his first and so far only instance of lucid dreaming. He told me of how desperately he wanted to wake up, but couldn't. When he left his room, he saw 5 sets of footprints, in dirt. There were no footprints leading to where they actually were, just 5 sets of footprints, as though something had just appeared and disappeared in one spot out of thin air. There were also 6 men in his dream, but he never found the other set of footprints, assuming that these prints belonged to the men in his dream. When he told the medicine man about this, he was, rightfully, baffled and terrified. He told Sam to call the others, but that he doubted the efficacy of their practices in light of the information he just shared. He still offered a blessing, which Sam accepted. Sam did indeed make a few calls, and told several other medicine men about what happened. They told him that something dark had set its eyes on him and that he was to be very cautious. He basically lived with Jess until the semester ended, only going home to grab something every once in a while. Sam moved back to the Chicago area for a brief period before Jess started her first semester for her MSW in another city, where he joined her. That's around the time we met on a gig, while he was working as a freelance photographer. Whether or not he left exactly because of the encounters and the dream, he has not really said. I know he was looking to live in a city with a vibrant arts community, but I do think the encounters were the straw that broke the camel's back. Sam says that he is often hesitant to return to the res, but still goes every now and then to see his dad. I'm sure the Skinwalkers miss him greatly.